Hello, my name is Nicolas Stackhouse, and in this video we'll be taking a look at my track Odyssey. Throughout the walkthrough, we'll be taking a look at the virtual instruments and samples that were used, as well as the mixing and mastering plugins. Let's take a look at the strings. For string ensemble 1, I'm using the Adastra Ensemble All Full Sustain Normal. For string ensemble 2, I'm using the Adastra Ensemble All Full Sustain Schindler. For violins 1 and 2, I'm using the Adastra Ensemble Violins Legato 1. For the violas, I'm using the Adastra Ensemble Violas Legato 1. For the cellos, I'm using the Adastra Ensemble Cellos Legato 1. For the basses, I'm using the Adastra Ensemble Basses Legato 1. String shorts 1 are using the Adastra Ensemble All Full Spiccato Feather. String shorts 2 are using the Adastra Ensemble All Full Staccato. The Byzantar is using the Byzantar Arc 4. And finally, for the violins portamento legato, we're using the Adastra Ensemble Violins Legato Porta. Let's take a look at the mix. Both string ensembles are being routed to a bus. On the string ensemble bus, we have OTT and some reverb. Violins 1 and 2 both have a high pass cutting anything below 250 Hz and are also being routed to the string ensemble bus. The violas have a high pass cutting anything below 200 Hz. The cellos have a high pass cutting anything below 150 Hz. Both instruments are also routed to the string ensemble bus. The basses don't have any effects on their individual channel and are routed directly to the string ensemble bus. For string shorts 1 and 2, we're both using some OTT and are both routed to the string shorts bus, where we have an EQ, punish light, driver, OTT, and realm. The Byzantar has some compression, delay, and reverb. It's also routed to the solo strings bus. The violin's portamento legato has OTT and driver, where it serves as an extra layer for the synth leads. Let's have a listen to the strings soloed. Now, on to the percussion. For this section here, we have cymbals from Damage 2 and some drum risers from Hybrid Tools Terminus. For the trailer drums, we have toms from Damage 2, the metal percussion is from Ferrum, and the rubber drums are from Evolution Devastator Breakout. Let's go ahead and take a look at the mix. On the cymbals, we have a bit of compression. It's also linked to its own bus as well, where we have a high-pass filter cutting anything below 250 Hz, and some reverb to give it a little more space and sound a little washier. The toms, metal percussion, rubber drums, as well as the drum risers are all linked to a single bus. In this case, it's called the trailer perc bus. OTT helps glue things a little more. Supercharger GT adds a tiny bit more punch, and having reverb to give your trailer drums an even larger than life sound doesn't hurt as well. Let's have a listen to these elements soloed. Up next, we have tune percussion. For the glockenspiels, I'm using the Age glockenspiel main and the staccato articulation. For the music box, I'm using the ATO Misfit Toy Instruments library and using the dry clean articulation. Let's take a look at the mix. Both the glockenspiels and the music box have a bit of compression. Both instruments are also routed to a bus, where there's an EQ doing a high pass cutting anything below 250 Hz, some OTT, and some reverb. Let's go ahead and listen to the tune percussion soloed. What I really like about these glockenspiels is that they really give that warm, almost whimsical fantasy feeling. Whereas the music box is a lot more raw and intimate and adds a great texture. And when you put both layers together, it creates something really haunting. Let's take a look at the brass. For the first layer, we're using the ATO Majestica brass and the power muted sustains articulation. The second, 66 trombones using the sustain articulation. And finally, 66 tubas playing the sustain articulation. Let's take a look at the mix. On the 66 tubas, we have a bit of compression. All three layers are then routed to a bus where there's some OTT. Again, simply glue things together and just make it sound a little punchier. And we finish it off with some reverb. Let's have a listen to the brass soloed. Now for Braahms. The majority of the Braahms were from Keep Forest's Devastator Breakout library, and the last layer was using Soundpaint's Braahms horn generator. Let's take a look at the mix. There are no effects on the individual channels, but instead they're all routed directly to a bus, where we have OTT and some reverb. Let's have a listen to the Braahms soloed. The piano consists of 3 layers. We have the 1928 Steinway Grand from Soundpaint, the Originals Intimate Grand Piano from Spitfire Audio, and the third and final layer, the Noir Felt from Galaxy Instruments. Each piano has their own compressor, and are all routed to a bus where there is further compression and reverb. Here's the piano and all its layers soloed. On to the rest of the keys and synths. For both pipe organs 1 and 2, I'm using the symphonic organ from Spitfire Audio. For the synth leads 1 and 2, I'm using Super 8, and in this case, it's essentially a supersaw, where synth lead 2 is the same synth, but played an octave lower. For the synth harp layers 1 and 2, I'm using Palindrome 2, for each a program I made for the library. Let's have a look at the mix. For the pipe organs, I'm using an EQ, cutting anything below 250 Hz, Spanish Light for a little bit of grit, OTT to glue things together a little more, and Realm for some reverb. The pipe organs are also being bussed over here. Its use is more for exporting stems. For the synth leads 1 and 2, There's Ruina, a very dark and gritty distortion plugin, and Driver, another distortion plugin. For the big synth lead, there are a few things happening here. For starters, we have a high pass cutting everything below 500 Hz. We have some OTT. After that, we have guitar rig, specifically just for this little instance here called the pitch pedal. This little knob here is automated to do that gradual drop in pitch you hear in the final section of the track. After that, we have some delay using Replica XT, and then we finish it off with some reverb. For the synth arps, both have a high pass cutting anything below 500 Hz. They're also being routed to a bus where there's a bit of OTT. Let's go ahead and listen to all these layers soloed. For the synth bass, I'm using Super 8, and I've created a synth very similar to the synth leads 1 and 2. The only difference is that it's heavily muffled with the use of a low-pass filter on one of the effects. For the pulse bass, I'm also using Super 8, but for a more short and aggressive stab to give the track a little more drive and movement. Let's take a look at the mix. For the synth bass, I'm using Ruina and Driver, and here we see that I'm cutting any frequencies above 250 Hz, giving it that warm, muffled sound. Both basses are also routed to the synth bass bus. Let's have a listen to the basses soloed. Now for the pulse bass. Together. On to the choirs. For the Epic Choir 1 and 2, I'm using the Lacrimosa Marcato patch. We have an EQ, OTT, and some reverb. Both channels are also routed to the choir bus. Let's have a listen to the elements soloed. Let's have a look at the ambience now. For the ambience, I used the Icelandia 1 library and had 4 parts morphing into each other, along with a low-pass filter muffling the sound a bit. Let's take a look at the mix. On the individual channel, there are no effects, but it's routed to the ambient textures bus, which is where the effects are. The first effect is an EQ, where we have a high-pass filter, cutting anything below 250 Hz. Next up, OTT. The third plugin is Portal, a granular effects plugin. Realm, for some reverb. And finally, an EQ to help keep certain frequencies under control. Let's have a listen to the ambience soloed. Onto the sound effects. For the subhits, I'm using the Hybrid Cinema subhits library from Soundpaint. The metallic trailer hits are from Keep Forest's Ferrum library. The subboom is also from Ferrum. The hybrid slams are from 8Dio's Hybrid Tools Terminus library, and the risers are also from 8Dio's Hybrid Tools Terminus library. None of these sound effects have any mixing plugins on their individual channels. Instead, all sound effects are routed to their own bus, where the sound is further sculpted. All hits and slams have a bit of OTT and reverb. On the risers bus, we have an EQ doing a high pass, cutting anything below 500 Hz, some OTT, and some reverb. Let's have a listen to some of these sounds soloed. For this last part, we'll be taking a look at the mastering session. Typically, the first thing I do with any master is do a quick fade in and fade out, but I also noticed that the first half of the track was a little too quiet, so I went ahead and raised the volume. I also found that this fade out created just a tiny bit more drama and tension. On to the mastering. The first part, some EQ, a dynamic EQ, an imager. We also have an EQ where we have a high pass here, cutting anything below 20 Hertz, as well as a low pass cutting anything above 18,000 Hertz. The final effect here we have is a maximizer. Most trailer music tends to be fairly loud, so I tend to keep it at negative 0.1 dB as a ceiling, and that's it. We've reached the end of the walkthrough. I just want to go ahead and say that there is no right or wrong way when it comes to mixing or composing music. This is simply how I do it and my process. Thank you for watching.